Hello and welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin. This episode is brought to you by Testimonial Hero. Testimonial Hero helps you close trust gaps with authentic, strategic video testimonials so that you can close more deals faster. On this episode, I'm joined by Gabi Contreras, who is a marketing consultant and advisor that focuses on helping fuel the go-to-market efforts of early-stage startups. We talk a lot about how voice of customer is often overlooked by startups, how to capture strong customer insights, and how to use customer voice to accelerate your go-to-market. On to the episode. Hey, Gabi, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dustin, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining me. So we're going to be talking about bunch of topics, all kind of centering around customer advocacy, but specifically with startups and smaller companies. So I want to dive right into that topic because I feel, voice of customer specifically can be neglected when you're very go at the startup stage. So I'm curious in your mind, why is it so critical and why should companies actually focus on it very early on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the voice of the customer, it's such a loaded term, right? Because we know that it's something that we need to stay close to, but especially at earlier stage companies or startups that are still kind of in that 0 to 10 million range, it can seem very daunting to approach, okay, how do we get closer to the customer? How can we start to cultivate these relationships? But, a study recently by Bain & Company found that with just a 5% increase in customer retention, you can grow your revenue from anywhere between 25 to 95% in profits. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to really capturing customer insights. When it comes to building an advocacy motion, there's so many components that go into it, but I think just having the willingness to start is really key.
Yeah, and I think I like that you led with the revenue piece. I think there's a bunch of intangibles there, like you said. As a byproduct, by talking to more customers, your sales process will get better, your positioning will get better. It's hard to sell that to a CFO when you say, hey, I need money to fund this. So I like the leading with revenue and retention, especially because it's really hard to get new customers right now. The economy is pretty sketchy still. It's, May 2023 for everyone listening. So I like that focus. Let's say you're small startup, just getting started, trying to stay scrappy, not blow out the budget here. Where should people start really with, getting the ball rolling on voice of customer?
I mean, I always like to say that at the early stage, you need to be hitting two birds with one stone. So part of it is, of course, building those initial relationships with your customers, kind of kicking things off with a warm introduction to the salesperson when you're maybe just a general marketing lead at a company, and just being able to get kind of those initial conversations going so you can drive that trust. But I think another really big piece of it is understanding the buyer motivations there. Because when you are talking to a customer right at the point that they join and that they're, the ink has dried, they're, right before starting onboarding, they're in this really precious phase where they still remember everything that went through the buying process. Yeah. They remember their requirements. They remember the vendors they evaluated. They remember who they spoke to. And they're already, in the early stages of becoming that, they're officially a customer for you, right? So that's a really critical time where you can really start to understand your buyer motivations and build those early relationships with, your customer base. So it's kind of that two-pronged approach. So figuring out a way to create a process around interviewing net new customers where, new buyers turned customers is a great place to start. It's a great place to start. And it also is just going to help you get validation around your message and whether what you're talking about on your website, on your blogs, whether it's really resonating with buyers or not. Because sometimes as marketers, we tend to think, well, we have all this content here and the messaging is aligned with the product and we've done a lot of research around this. But if you're not testing it out in front of customers, then, you're kind of missing out a key opportunity there. And one tactic that I like kind of consulting my clients on is taking the opportunity when you're still kind of going through maybe a repositioning or when you're rolling out a new feature, a new product. Make sure that you're testing out different variations for the messaging in front of customers. Put it on a slide, have them react to it. I have found that to be a really effective way to get genuine responses, and you can kind of see them on the camera, on screen, on Zoom, and you can get a feel for, oh, I thought that was something that sounded really good and that buyers were going to like, but this customer didn't seem to like it. So maybe this isn't something that we should be rolling out as part of our launch or our repositioning.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned two things we're working on right now and just did. So it's very,
I
very
love it.
relevant for us.
Yes.
Yeah, like we're going through, we're updating our strategic narrative, our story, new website coming in like a month and a half. But that was our test. Like we threw it on Sales Deck and we're running it by people live on calls because you get, we record it using conversational intelligence. We can go back, see what works, what didn't. And then the other one, which I think most companies don't do, and we don't do yet, it's something I was talking to Sam about today, is basically like a one interview, like you just described, right? When they're fresh, asking the reasons why. Because in the past, I've done loss analysis and you just can't get those people to reply. You can't learn from them. They just ghost you and they're
hard.
gone.
They really do. They really do. And I mean, I think one tactic that I like to recommend, which, it has varying response rates, but just put all of your lost emails into an email sequence that goes out every 3 months. So you're just sending out a survey with some sort of incentive, like an Amazon gift card or something. Like I said, it has varying responses, but at least trying to get those lost interviews is important, or just some sort of insight is super helpful.
Yeah, exactly. No, on the loss and the one, because I think otherwise you rely on like the salesperson's intuition, which is often very good,
Right.
but also not directly from the customer. So there's that
Right.
like sales lens. I've done hundreds of these. This is my interpretation. So I think that's all good. So I love the customer research part and the not being afraid to ask early, because I think oftentimes marketing and CS people can be a little cautious. Like they just sign, leave them alone, don't bug them.
Yeah. I think that's a good time. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I totally agree. And I was going to say, aside from the research side, if you're early stage, how do you start thinking about creating content from your customers and getting that voice out into the wild?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge, and it really depends on the industry that you're working in, right? Because I've worked with some clients where they're super okay with letting you use their logos, but then no case studies, or the reverse, and I think there are different ways you can get creative. Again, like I said, this window between closing and onboarding is a really good time to kind of get some of those initial asks, or like just pulse checking if they'd be willing to do something further down the line. Obviously, anonymized things aren't the greatest thing to lean into, but I think sometimes you can just take some of those initial quotes or perspectives that are presented in those interviews and kind of showcase them in an interesting way. One thing that I've, worked on in the past has been basically putting together some sort of use case repository, which I also mentioned on the last episode. But I think that the value of being able to include how customers are using the product is really important. So even if you're just able to enable your sales team with specific ways that customers are using the product, that can play a really big role in just giving them some extra juice to work with and to feel more confident in how they are talking about what we do and how we do it, and giving them more relevant examples to throw into conversations when they're talking to a buyer directly.
Yeah, and I think getting that, like you said, in a document of some kind and getting the process there is important, because, when you're early stage, let's say you have 2 sales reps, it's easy. They will just tell their stories and what they know. But then when you add 5 more, like you need that repository, or those stories just disappear.
Yeah.
I'm curious there how you structured it, like just to dive into it a little bit. Was it mostly around persona, industry use case, or specific topic? Like how do you make that easy for people to use?
First, you need to ask your sales team what they need, and then you filter it by what they need. But I would really recommend industry first, because it always tends to be I need a case study from the auto industry. Can you help me? And so the industry is usually the place that I would recommend starting in terms of filtering industry, followed by persona, because I think personas are also a really big enablement area that you have so many answers to when you're the one, talking to customers directly. And that actually goes into another point that I like to bring up is that, I think a lot of times when sales is hiring and bringing on new AEs, they're really focused on training the salespeople on their technology, but I think it's really important to put that training into the context of the customer. And at early stage companies, it's all still very, very close together and close knit. Everyone is talking to each other. And I think that's where you have a really big opportunity to help your sellers understand the customer, educate them on the customer. Because sometimes, the technology aspect, I mean, that's of course a very important part of the enablement. But if a salesperson is coming in from an industry that maybe is completely irrelevant to the one that you're serving, they need a little extra help in understanding buyer motivations, buyer behaviors, buyer attitudes. What do they care about? And I think that's where the work of customer research and customer advocacy plays a really big role in helping your sellers feel confident as quickly as possible so that they can go and, close more business.
Yeah, and I think just having it in the voice of the customer makes it more believable as well.
Mhm.
You can tell your salesperson, this is how you handle this objection, but then, educated buyers will just know the sales guy probably has a script of these things. Whereas if you say customer X went with us, they had the same concern, totally valid, here's why
Mhm.
they didn't. That just hits a little bit harder and I think is more trustworthy.
Mhm.
And personally, like I find buyers, myself included, trust sellers and marketers less now more than ever. Very skeptical. Maybe I'm just a little jaded, but I feel like that happens out there. So you really need that voice to actually build trust with people.
Mhm. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And then, so we talked a little bit about capturing the market research, the topics. I'm curious then how your thoughts on how best to distribute it. So, right, there's so many different mediums, types from case studies to quick snippets to videos to reference calls. How do you think through that and what to use at what time?
Mhm. I mean, I always like to first start with the cornerstone piece of whatever it is that I'm working on at that point, and then figuring out how I can chop that up and deliver it in the areas that are highest impact. So that's going to vary by organization, right? And for, when you're have fewer resources and you're having to move fast, I usually like to make sure that we're all collaborating and working towards some of the same pillars as a marketing organization more broadly, and then
Mhm.
figuring out ways to incorporate whatever it is that where the voice of the customer needs to shine, focusing the efforts on how that's going to fuel the core objectives for the entire team that quarter. So, if you have an upcoming product launch, figuring out, okay, what are the things that need to happen in order for this launch to be successful? And how can I make sure that the customer voice is being embedded and integrated into every step of this launch? And I think then from there, once you have an idea of the bigger overarching objective of the campaign, of whatever it is that the big rock of the team, then I think it's a lot easier to figure out, okay, if we're going to be doing a webinar, if we're going to be doing, like a big push on LinkedIn, these are the assets that need to be created to then support that. But I'm a big fan of just making sure that whatever it is that, especially at earlier stage, whatever it is that you're working on, it's laddering into a specific initiative. It's not just about rolling out a case study to roll out the case study, but if we're targeting a specific industry this quarter, what are the things that I can do that I can roll out quickly? The assets for maybe a new industry that we're targeting harder are going to be different. Why? Because that also entails deeper sales enablement. Whereas, maybe the launch materials that you're creating are going to be more external, kind of, prospect facing, so to say. Still going to be some enablement component there, but the primary objectives are kind of two different things. And at an earlier stage, the voice of the customer or just having access to customer insights is really key to really get the internal organization aligned and then be able to go out and have a more cohesive message.
Yeah, and I like that you said, don't make a case study just to create a case study, which I've been guilty of that in the past because
Me too. Let's be honest. Honestly.
yeah, it becomes like this checkboxy sales wants this thing, I'm going to create it.
Mhm.
But with how easy, like we were talking a little bit before about this, with how easy you can create half decent case studies using AI, for example, and that's just going to get better and better.
Yeah.
Having that general recommendation case study that just lives on your website, probably not enough and probably not the best use of your customers' time, in my opinion. Like people, I think, have to get more creative, chop things up, have different types of video, different types of interviews.
Yeah.
So curious your thoughts there and how you see AI impacting all of this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, things have to be chopped up these days. Everything needs to be
Yeah.
consumable for an audience that has an average attention span of I think 3 seconds or something like that. Well, I mean, AI is impacting. I mean, I personally think that generative AI is going to play a really big role in how well we are able to understand our customers. And I think this goes, I think for a lot of people, we think, okay, well, maybe that means that I have to integrate some tool, or if I'm looking at VOC, then that means that I have to pay a big budget in order to get all this research. But there's actually a lot of ways that you can use generative AI yourself to understand what's happening with your customers, understand their behaviors, and to also do things like competitive analysis. So you can take third party review platforms, pull them in, give a command to generate, what are the top reviews, lower reviews, how you stack up against competitors, how customers are feeling about your product. You can even use it to craft questionnaires and surveys to then ship to your customer and to have them respond back as well. And I think that this is just a small way that we can start to apply these in our own roles, right? When we're kind of needing to do so much research. And I've made it a point now in my day to day. I always will, at least once or twice a day, I'll stop and I'll think, is there something I can be doing at this step of my process that can be automated or
Yeah.
simplified in some way? And, it causes a small friction point in my day because I'm just like, oh, now I have to go and research and maybe see if there's something else I can use for this. But the answer is almost always yes. And then that way I've learned something new to create a better workflow for me. And now with things like Google Bard and ChatGPT, it's just way more accessible. It's not so much about having to have, maybe like a fancy tool, which are still really cool. But again, we're talking about low budget marketing teams here. And so I think that's where tools like that can just skyrocket what you're working on.
Yeah, and I think to, hopefully bring it full circle here, it does, like you said, it democratizes it where a small company who would push off customer marketing, voice of customer, et cetera, because they don't have time, they're an 8-person team, they're just focused on bringing revenue in the door and that's all they care about. Now, if you can automate the research, especially on the competitive front, you can automate some of the creation of the content, at least get you halfway. There's kind of less excuses not to do it, right? Like the I don't have time thing is a little bit less valid. What I'm curious about though is how people stand out then. Like eventually, if this is a race to the bottom and we're all able to do this super easy, what are your thoughts on making voice of customer actually different and memorable and stand out in the noise?
Hmm. I mean, I think it's about putting their faces front and center as much as you can,
Yeah.
which again, it's not easy to get there. I think it's a process to build those relationships in a way that you can actually get to a point where you are just on a very chummy basis with your customers, and you can include them front and center on video content, on social media. But yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take a lot to differentiate, but really the more that you can step back from being the voice and putting the customers front and center, I think that's going to be honestly the harder thing. But I would say quality over quantity is the name of the game now.
Mhm.
Because like you said, now the quantity is, you know, that's table stakes, because with AI you can generate way more content. But now it's okay, how can we really make this a high quality piece of cornerstone content? And how can we slice this up and distribute it in a way that's going to capture people's attention? And I think that's also where understanding where your sweet spot is with your customers is going to help you. Because the best way to stand out against the noise is to figure out, well, why is it that you stand out with your customers? And then using that and putting it front and center in all of your marketing strategy.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to look at it. And, like you said, it really boils down to that creativity and getting away from the table stakes approach. And you see some companies doing that even with like old school case studies, right? So Influitive has their Upshot program where it's first person and it's a little bit more engaging. I know companies like Amplitude and others are using that. I'm
Mhm.
curious what that next step is going to be when it comes to interviews, right? Like, I find it interesting to have a customer demo my product for me and, run that as an ad, like
Ooh.
find a way to do that. I think there's going to be a lot of that going forward. And maybe the traditional, I recommend Company X because of this reason, might not fly as much, especially written, because I could just tell AI to pretend to write me one, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a bit of that authenticity thing as well that I think is going to come
Mhm.
up.
No, but that's really interesting. Yeah, I actually had never thought of having a customer demo a product. I know that we usually bring them. I've brought them on or recommended bringing them on earlier on in the sales cycle, which has actually driven some success. But yeah,
Yeah.
I guess it's all about getting creative with what you're doing, right? And I'm very curious to see how Testimonial Hero starts to uplift also all of their stuff as we enter this new wave of content creation.
Yeah, we've been experimenting with a bunch of stuff on our end and revamping our style and, generating case studies from our transcripts and all this stuff because it's just changing really fast. And like to go back to the small company thing, we're small enough where we can actually move quickly. So
That's the
that's our
best.
goal there.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it's a really fun time. It's also really scary because AI is terrifying and exciting at the same time, but it's a good time to be figuring this out.
Yeah, I agree, I agree.
Yeah. Awesome. So we covered, a lot on how to tie voice of customer to revenue, how early stage companies should get going on that.
Mhm.
I know this is something you focus on a lot on social as well. So if our listeners want to reach out, learn more, where should they go to do that?
Yes, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I specialize in helping early stage startups with, that early phase 0 to 1 marketing strategy that involves everything from customer to product to content. So, if you're interested, just feel free to reach out on LinkedIn.
Okay, awesome. So we'll include those links for our listeners. And Gabby, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much, Dustin. It was great to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode. So my key takeaway is the value of doing a one analysis early in the customer's journey. So just after they've signed on, and will they still remember everything from their buying process? That way you get insights as to why they chose you, and it lets you build that strong relationship from the start. Plus it's easier to get a reply than just a loss analysis where most people will ghost you when you ask them, why they didn't go with you. So if you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts and click follow or shoot us a quick review. I'll be back next week with a new episode.